Honor mode in Baldur's Gate 3 is considerably difficult. The permadeath run is perhaps one of the most classic concepts for a video game challenge run, and to apply such a challenge to a game as expansive as Baldur's Gate is a heavy ask. However, this challenge has been taken on and overcome by many people. A common element of many of these runs is the use of reclassing through withers and multiclassing thereafter. Some characters aren't as optimal as they could be in their starting class, and even for those that are good enough as they are, the nigh risk-free method the game provides to overhaul your level progression at any point is a huge boon. It allows you to tweak your party for whatever present challenge your progression could warrant precisely. I have never done an honor mode run before now, but this aspect of the mode made me curious. What would an honor mode run look like with no reclassing or multiclassing whatsoever? This would mean that every character is locked into the level progression that they start the game at, excepting choices of subclasses, and every decision made on each level will be permanent. In a sense, this would be a kind of lore-accurate honor mode run, where Gale is as much of a wizard as he is in the story, and Shadowheart is as determined of a trickery cleric as we know her to be. This would require an intense amount of foresight and strategic planning for each of the characters to make the most out of the limited tools at their disposal. As you will hopefully realise throughout the course of this run, my foresight leaves a bit to be desired. Regardless, the idea made me curious, which was what led to the video you are watching now. My name is Asta, and this is Can You Beat Baldur's Gate 3's Honor Mode with no reclassing or multiclassing? We start, of course, at character creation. For this run I have chosen to start as a half Wood Elf wizard for a few reasons. The Wood Elf Fleet of Foot feature synergizes well with the Ray of Frost cantrip to ensure that opponents stay out of melee range, and Shocking Grasp helps to escape those situations in which outmaneuvering an opponent is not possible. For the stat spread, I have opted for 9 strength, 8 dexterity, 14 constitution, 17 intelligence, 13 wisdom and 14 charisma. To those who are familiar with this system, this stat spread will likely look like complete nonsense. However, I promise that there is an intention behind this build that will come up after not too long. For the background, I picked the Guild Artisan for insight and persuasion proficiencies, 2 skills I consider consistently useful over the course of the story, as well as the Arcana and Investigation proficiencies to make the most out of the high intelligence this build will possess. For spells, the only strictly necessary ones for my early game plans are Disguise Self and Enhanced Leap. However, Magic Missile can be made into a surprisingly effective damage tool early on with the right setup, and a combination of shield, mage armour and false life improves survivability all around. We tweak our Dream Guardian a bit for no real reason other than cosmetics, and this is a good opportunity to mention the inspiration behind my character. Kalia, as is her name, is named and designed after the character I used on my first Lunatic Classic run of Fire Emblem Awakening, which is another highly intensive strategy RPG challenge from my past. The illusion adds nothing to the challenge, but I thought it was a nice touch. We recruit us, meet Lae'zel, save Shadowheart, and this is where the first tactics of the run rear their heads. I equip Command and Sanctuary on Shadowheart before entering the fight with Commander Zolk. I give Sanctuary to Lae'zel in advance and use the free restoration to replenish Shadowheart's spell slots. In the fight itself, I use Command Drop on Commander Zolk to force him to drop the Everburn Blade, and with Lae'zel still having several turns of Sanctuary left, she can safely dash past to grab the blade before leaving for the transponder. We wake up on the beach, grab Shadowheart, and kill a couple of intellect devourers. This fight has unironically ended one of my attempts of this challenge down to simply terrible back-to-back rolls, and you may want to skip this fight by jumping up the cliffside instead on your run. Regardless, this was completed without incident. We recruit Astarion and hit level 2. Here, we pick the Divination subclass for our wizard. Portent is a consistently powerful ability no matter where you are in the course of the story, and it is particularly helpful on Honor mode as a means to counteract inevitable strings of bad rolls. With this level, we pick up Thunderwave and Featherfall, the former being a powerful damage tool and the latter being a helpful utility all around. We kill a Mind Flayer and recruit Gale, but we opt not to level him up just yet. With the Divination Wizard already on the team, I was left indecisive about what to do with Gale. My indecisiveness in this matter might play a role later on. We convince the Tieflings to run away, free Lae'zel, and promptly swap out Gale with her for the next section. Now it is time for another tactic to pay off. We carefully approach the Emerald Grove, making sure not to trigger the fight just yet, and then we give Enhanced Leap to Lae'zel. Just before entering the fight, we have Lae'zel enter a dash so that she will not need to use an action on it when the fight begins. The moment Lae'zel gets her turn, we have her jump up to the Warhorn beside Zevlor so that she can continuously blow it every time the turn cycles back to her. This gives a non-stop string of 8 temporary hit points to all allies, and makes finishing this fight easy. Completing this fight with no ally deaths gives us a free inspiration point from Lae'zel, which is a nice addition. After selling the Goblin's gear, we make our way to the Goblin camp. Now it is time for the next tactic. The next few battles against the Goblins guarding the way can be automatically skipped if the player is a Drow. As it happens, this also works if the player is disguised as a Drow with the Disguise Self spell. This makes traversing the next few areas easy and quickly gets us to level 3. For this level, we pick up Arcane Lock and Invisibility. The former is rather niche, but there are 2 points in this run where you can make good use out of them, and the latter is consistently helpful. For Astarion, we take the Assassin subclass for the consistently high damage output with stealth tactics, and for Lae'zel we pick up the Battlemaster subclass with Distracting Strike, Rally, and Riposte for excellent combat utilities when paired with Astarion's sneak attack. We convince Shadowheart to tell us about her devotion to Shah, enter the Goblin camp, witness an occult ritual, rescue Voldo, rescue another prisoner, find Scratch, save Marcus, and head for Joaquin's Rest. Rescuing Councillor Floric nets us the Spell Sparkler, a quarterstaff that gives us 2 lightning charges every time we deal damage with a spell or cantrip. Because Magic Missile at the lowest level is guaranteed to hit a target 3 times, this allows us to rapidly build up lightning charges for increased accuracy and damage output on our spells. We meet the Githyanki, making use of Lae'zel's astral knowledge to improve our odds of succeeding the deception save. Then we pester an old woman and break into her secret abode behind her fireplace for extra experience. We recruit Will, save a goblin prisoner this time, convince Korga to let Arabella go, talk with Nettie, tell a couple of absolutists to go away, and that gets us up to level 4 with very minimal combat. Level 4 is an important breakpoint, as it is when characters get their first feats. We pick up the Minor Illusion cantrip for later, and the Hold Person and Misty Step spells. From here, we take an ability improvement feat to get our wizard to 18 intelligence and 14 wisdom. We take Tough for Shadowheart, as high health on her will be necessary for later game strategies, as well as Sharpshooter and Great Weapon Master for Astarion and Lae'zel respectively to maximize their damage output. We say hi to an owlbear, learn Detect Thoughts from a scroll, and go to the Walk Pens to save Halson. Magic Missile takes out the smaller goblins easily, and our damage output takes out the rest. Now comes the goblin leaders. We use Arcane Lock on the door to Priestess Gut's room to prevent anyone from entering or leaving the area, and quickly run Gut down with 2 sneak attacks and a swing from Lae'zel. In the event this did not go according to plan, my next tactic was to use Silence with Shadowheart to prevent Gut from calling for help. On this attempt, it wasn't necessary. We sneak behind Gut's room to steal the Amulet of Misty Step, enlist the help of Lump the Enlightened, and recruit Karlach. We take the Wild Heart subclass with the Bear Heart selection to improve her ability to tank damage as much as possible, and we give her the Great Weapon Master feat as well. With Reckless Attack, she is far more likely to land these boosted attacks than most characters would be. We confront Anders and make an effort to kill him as soon as possible. His Divine Smites deal substantial damage even through Karlach's rage, and the fight would quickly spin out of control if he was given more than a few turns to attack. But with him dead, the rest of the fight is easy. We bring Karlach back to our camp and do our first long rest. We convince Will not to kill Karlach, find Scratch in the morning, and sneak our way to the Underdark entrance in the Goblin camp. While here, we get some free experience by killing the Minotaur that attempts to go through the entrance, and we pick up the stray oil barrels laying around the place before heading back up. We ambush Minthara and prevent unnecessary alerts by breaking the platform underneath the scrying eye, and she lands a hold person on Lae'zel, quickly downing her afterwards. This fight was some trouble, not least because a random goblin shoved our wizard into the cavern, but we got through it and revived our wizard afterwards. We went back to the owlbear nest and found the mother owlbear dead. In the goblin camp, we found the owlbear cub and convinced the goblins to let the cub go into our protection. Now it is time, finally, for Dror Ragzlin. A typical, sensible strategy for doing this fight reliably would be to grind up to level 5 and use the help of both Lump the Enlightened and Halsin to offset the chaos that Dror Ragzlin's legendary action can incite. This was in fact how I did it on several previous attempts, but this time my session came at the end of a long day and I was feeling too lazy to deal with the fight fairly, so what I did instead was line up the oil barrels we collected previously from the Underdark around the goblins and lured all of them close using Minor Illusion. As you'd expect, Barrelmancy was effective as ever and most of the fight was cleared out immediately. For the stragglers left behind, I called up Lump the Enlightened and let them deal with the fight with no more resource expenditure on my part. I'd see them afterwards to avoid any issues and crawl our way back to Halsin to let him know that the goblin leaders were eradicated. We pick up the Robe of Summer from the Emerald Grove as our reward and let the tieflings stay over at camp for the night. We begin a romance with Shadowheart, and out of some semblance of aesthetics, I go back to the Emerald Grove in the morning to dye my new robe. It is statistically superior to my previous robe, but it is too hard on the eyes for me to imagine spending many more hours staring at it. And with that, the Emerald Grove plotline is complete. The next day I picked up where I left off with one of many forgetful moments of the playthrough on my mind. I realised that when I killed Dror Ragzlin I had completely forgotten to loot his treasure at the back of his arena. This was quickly rectified by sneaking back into the goblin camp with an invisibility spell and looting it without triggering combat. After that we head straight for the mountain pass. It is here that we will find a particularly useful item for this run, but it was important to complete the Emerald Grove questline first, so that the Rite of Thorns would not be completed and access to the Emerald Grove would not be abruptly blocked off. Down at the monastery, we use another clever tactic to easily make our way into the Githyanki creche. We send our wizard ahead by herself, with temporary hit points granted by false life, while the rest of our party stays hidden from far away. The moment we enter the cutscene with the Githyanki by the entrance, we choose to enter combat. Entering combat here prevents the Githyanki from locking the passage to the creche, and simply using invisibility to charge past them allows us to enter the creche and gain another chunk of experience. Grabbing the waypoint inside allows us to teleport the rest of our companions into the creche, and this is where we finally capitalize on the strange statistic distribution I had my wizard start at for this playthrough. Or at least I should have been able to capitalize on it, but the fact that this was my first time doing the full honor mode run became apparent here, as it would many times in the future. The Quartermistress Jira sells gloves of dexterity, gloves which provide their wearer with an automatic 18 dexterity. On all of my previous playthroughs, I've entered this area with more than enough gold to buy it from her. What I didn't realize is that the price of these gloves skyrockets on honor mode, and I didn't have anywhere close to enough gold on this playthrough, so I had to improvise. The obvious way to go about this would be to wait until after the fight against the Inquisitor. At that point, the entire creche turns permanently hostile, which gives an excuse to kill Jira and loot the gloves from her corpse. However, this would mean waiting quite a bit longer to get the gloves, and I didn't like the idea of going much further before getting such an integral part of my build. What I opted for instead was to exploit the ways in which the temporary hostility condition works. If you attempt to pickpocket Jira and fail, she and the other Githyanki will become hostile. But if you then leave the area and return, they will cease to be hostile until you attempt to pickpocket her again. So by sending Astarion into the creche exclusively, I could try to pickpocket the gloves from Jira, fail, use Astarion's double dash to run far enough away to go back to camp, and then returned to the creche to try again. After an abnormally long time and a death on Astarion's part, this strategy worked out and I was able to get the Gloves of Dexterity. With the Gloves of Dexterity retrieved from my wizard, my strange stat distribution from the beginning will likely start to make sense. With 9 Strength, 18 Dexterity, 14 Constitution, 18 Intelligence, 14 Wisdom, and 14 Charisma, I have a wizard that has very high rolls in every ability check except for strength checks. This comes with the limitation that I can't equip anything else in my hand slots, but as it stands, there are only niche situations later in the story where other options would be particularly desirable. And so we move on from the creche for now and say hello to Elminster, who we bring back to our camp to talk with Gale about his condition. From here, we move down to the Underdark and meet the Myconid colony, where we go to meet with Blurg. Blurg has the Psychic Spark amulet, which boosts the number of projectiles on our magic missile spells and gives us a free cast of magic missile per long rest. Combined with the Spell Sparkler, this makes our build especially good at building up lightning charges. To make the most use out of this, we also pick up the Lifebringer headpiece, which gives us temporary hit points anytime we gain lightning charges. We head down to the Decrepit village and make use out of our Detect Thoughts spell to convince the Dwergar to let us pass. This gives us the ability to steal their boat without entering combat, and so we make our way to the Grimforge, deceiving Corsair along the way to avoid even more combat. This was where I made one error, as I opted to use the Friends cantrip on him to increase my odds of succeeding the check, thinking that concentration would remain through the coming cutscenes. It did not, and so Corsair realised he had been charmed afterwards, which forced me into another check. With an inspiration point and Eagle Splendor from Shadowheart, however, we got out of it unscathed. This was where I made yet another small error. While talking with the Herdmasters, I was skipping through the dialogue quickly enough that I accidentally selected the wrong option, triggering a fight with the Herdmasters and the Rothe. But this should be no problem, with Astarion's initiative and a ranged sneak attack. But where the fuck did his bow go? I genuinely had no idea he had lost his bow up until this point, and I wasn't going to cycle through footage mid-combat to figure out what happened. So I opted instead to have the party run away, and picked up a new bow for Astarion to use in the meanwhile before returning to clear out the Herdmasters. My screw up with the dialogue choices meant that I could not use the Rothe to clear out the rubble, but luckily I had a smoke powder barrel left over from my previous barrelmancy that got me through. Up the stairs, we disable a few traps and pick up the Protecty Sparks wall. Yes, somehow that is actually its name. This robe grants the wielder a bonus to their spell save difficulty class, as well as additional armor class and saving throws whenever they have lightning charges. This is arguably better than the robe my wizard was wearing previously, and vitally, it's a bit less hard on the eyes and looks good with some dye. From here, we make our way to the Grimforge and unlock the waypoint close to the battle with Grim for some exploration experience. But because we are as close as we are to getting level 5, I opt to return to the Underdark and kill a couple of Minotaurs to level up. At level 5, we opt to pick up Haste and Counterspell. Haste is arguably one of the strongest buff spells in the game if used properly, even with its nerf on Honor mode, and Counterspell gives us a get out of jail free card in numerous bad situations. Now that we have hit level 5, I go back to Auntie Ethel's hideout for the battle against her. Auntie Ethel is not a particularly necessary boss, and most people would do this fight to get the stat booster you can acquire for sparing her. But in my case, I'm not doing this for the stat booster. I'm doing this because I hate Auntie Ethel on a personal level and want her to die painfully. We use Enhanced Leap and Featherfall to skip most of the traps in Ethel's lair, and then have Astarion sneak past her to free Mayrina and loot some useful gear from the back. From there, we all sneak up on Auntie Ethel, Lae'zel and Astarion take speed potions to improve their burst damage, and the fight begins. This was another instance where my lack of honor mode knowledge came through. Prior to this fight, my impression was that her legendary action would trigger at the start of her turn. Her legendary action allows her to use Coven of Hags whenever a spell is cast in her vicinity. My idea was to burst Ethel down with damage and then cast Silence on her with Shadowheart so that she would not have the opportunity to use Coven of Hags. In hindsight, this was quite a silly lapse of thought, as most legendary actions operate as reactions and can be done on the player's turn, and so Auntie Ethel quickly spreaded their clones around and turned the fight into a bit of chaos. However, despite this trouble, this fight wasn't too difficult in the end. There's a little tactic I can mention here. One way of identifying the real Ethel from the fake Ethels is to check which Ethel has the Fey life condition on their stat table. Only the real Ethel have this condition, which takes the guesswork out of the fight. Being much more careful from here to only use spells in moments that they're particularly necessary, it wasn't too much effort to run Ethel down. She attempts to get away by striking a deal with us, but the only deal I want is the one that causes her the greatest suffering, so we refuse and kill her shortly afterwards. And so we resurrect Connor and send Mayrina and her zombie husband on their way to Baldur's Gate. We take another long rest and have a small magic coaching session with Gale. He tries to riz me up, but Shadow has my heart. We go back to the Grimforge and pick up the Bow of the Banshee for Astarion. While not as iconic as the Titan String Bow, the Bow of the Banshee is a pretty solid bow that, unlike the former, doesn't require much preparation to get maximal usage out of. We use Detect Thoughts on Brithvar to convince him to join us in the rebellion against Nia, and we use another small tactic to get rid of the Scrying Eye. If you are ever caught trying to sneak by a Scrying Eye, the eye will deviate from its usual path to attempt to follow you to wherever you go next. So by attempting and failing to sneak repeatedly, we can drag the Scrying Eye to any section of the Grimforge we want. We opt to drag the Scrying Eye down to the boat dock out of line of sight of anyone else, and we have Lae'zel toss it into the water for an instant kill with no one being alerted. Now we start the fight against True Soul Nia. There wasn't a whole lot to say about this one. Keeping most of our fighters on the rafters while Lae'zel and the allies kept attention was helpful, and a particular priority was killing the Mindmasters first, as they had the ability to coerce allies into fighting for them. Lae'zel spent longer than I'd like running around out of my control, but we eventually got her back on track. The only other notable part of this fight was another instance of me misunderstanding how a legendary action would work. I was under the impression that Nia's psionic visage counters would spawn in an area around him, not directly on the individual who targeted him, which led to one instance of taking unnecessary damage and losing a spell concentration. But by this point, the fight was basically over. We convinced Kirgrath to let the gnome slaves free and pick up the disintegrating Nightwalkers from Nia's body. This was the main reason for doing this fight. These boots give a free cast of Misty Step and prevent the wearer from being webbed, entangled, ensnared, and from slipping on grease or ice. They are very useful for a character who is reliant on maintaining spell concentrations and for staying away from melee combat, and as it happens, we just recently took up the haste spell on our wizard. With this, maintaining haste for longer in chaotic battles should be feasible. Now it is time for us to take on the fight with Grim. We kill a couple of animated armors, grab some mithril ore, and head down to the adamantine forge to start the fight. This fight is terribly risky without extensive preparation, and as it stood, I hadn't really done much preparation at all. But as is fitting for a boss with 3 intelligence, it is also notable for being one of the easiest bosses to cheese by taking advantage of its predictable AI, so I didn't feel any need to make this harder on myself. Standing up on the platform well above the adamantine forge, we can trigger the fight by having Lae'zel shoot the lava valve. We wait until Grim notices us, hit the lava valve again, and then use Minor Illusion to distract Grim. His intelligence is low enough that he is almost guaranteed to fail the investigation check, and this leads him to continuously travel towards the forge hammer, where we can hit the lever from afar to deal substantial damage to him all at once. Realistically, I could have also beaten this fight by simply using Minor Illusion to distract him while on the same playing field, but I didn't feel I had any obligation to take that risk when he is as easy as he is to manage. We featherfall our way down to the platform below and pick up our reward, the adamantine splint armour. This armour has an AC of 18, it reduces all damage taken by 2, and it nullifies all critical hits. This armour is a huge upgrade for Lae'zel, who will be using it for most of the run from here with some optimizations down the line. There was a not insubstantial portion of the footage here that has gone missing. Presumably I forgot to record it entirely, but the vital part is that we have taken the tools we have now to enter the Shadowlands through the Grimforge. The next major obstacle is the fight against Flaming Fist Marcus to protect Isabel and the Last Light Inn. This fight can roll intensely out of control if the Winged Horrors are given a chance to gang up on Isabel, who is very susceptible to being paralysed by them. But of course, we have the tool at our disposal to make sure the Winged Horrors can't swarm into the room. In fact, we can ensure no one can enter or leave, however terrible Isabel's AI might be. Using Arcane Lock on the 2 doors into the room, leaving only the door out to the balcony where the cutscene with Isabel begins, we can heavily minimise the number of winged horrors that swarm inside and funnel them through a convenient choke point, and so keeping Isabel alive turns out to be no serious trouble. We bring Karlach to Dammon to talk about her infernal engine, as I forgot to do so back at the Emerald Grove. We kill the fake ox, collect some infernal iron, and acquire pieces of the flawed Helldusk armour set to sell for an easy bit of gold. We head out to the Shadow-Cursed lands, trick Karnas into giving us his moon lantern, and release the pixie to get protection from the Shadow Curse. Mizora bothers us about Zariel's asset and we enter Moonrise Towers for some free exploration experience. In Balthazar's room we solve a small puzzle to get the Cold Brim hat, which allows us to apply frost on enemies quickly using our magic missiles. We head out to meet Balthazar, find Arabella, and had Astarion talk with Raphael about their deal. There's a cheeky position on this cliffside where we can snipe the Kuo-toa from far enough away that combat does not start with them, and this gets some of us up to level 6. Here, we pick up Darkness and Knock. Darkness is a spell with some interesting utilities that will become obvious as the run progresses, while on the other hand, there is only one place where Knock is particularly useful. But useful it is in that instance. We need only a tiny bit more experience to get Lae'zel and Shadowheart up to level 6 as well, so now seems to be as good a time as any to go back to the Githyanki creche. Submitting ourselves to the Zaith'isk and passing all the saving throws nets us enough experience to get everyone to level 6, which gets Lae'zel her next feat. For this we pick up Heavy Armour Master, which increases her strength to 18 and makes her take 3 less damage from all non-magical sources. Stacking with the Adamantine armour means that Lae'zel now takes 5 less damage from all non-magical sources and 2 less damage from all magical sources. This will not be the last time that damage negation on Lae'zel is brought up. It is time, finally, to stop beating around the bush and confront the battle with the Inquisitor. One strategy I considered using for this section would have made use out of the Eversight ring, a ring which will come up again later. The Inquisitor cannot use his legendary action while covered in a darkness spell, and the Eversight ring allows the wearer to see through magical darkness. Using Minor Illusion to lure all the fighters into the centre of the arena, covering them with darkness and having Lae'zel run in with the Eversight ring to rush down the Inquisitor could feasibly make the beginning of the fight easier. But this fight came at the end of another long day for me, and I feel no remorse choosing a boss such as this, so I instead made use of some leftover barrels and smoke powder satchels to clear out the Inquisitor and his allies. This did not result in an instant kill, but it made dealing with the remaining enemies much simpler. And so we pick up the Circlet of Psionic Revenge, a very good headpiece for Lae'zel, and the Gloves of Belligerent Skies. In most cases, the Gloves of Dexterity are markedly preferable for our wizard, but these gloves can add extra damage output to our magic missiles in the occasions that it is warranted. We say hi to the Dream Visitor, pick up a Wall of Stone scroll that will be more relevant than I ever imagined it would be, and we leave the astral plane. We fight our way out of the creche and take revenge on the Quarter Mistress who made getting those gloves so difficult for us. From there, we loot the Knife of the Undermountain King from her body. This is one of numerous tools in the game that reduces the critical hit attack roll by 1, meaning that a 19 will now be considered a critical hit. Importantly, as it specifies, this effect can stack. We give this knife to Astarion, who is particularly likely to get critical hits due to easily getting advantage in mid-combat, and this will not be the last time this effect is mentioned. Voss greets us at camp and Lae'zel turns against Vlaakith, setting her story arc in motion. We head back to the Shadowlands, mopping up some easy experience by talking Malus Thorm into his death. Now it is time for the battles to end the Shadow Curse, and this is perhaps a good time to come forward with a confession. This run was only my second full run of this game ever, and on my first run, I never ended up doing this side quest. Needless to say, I was a bit antsy about getting this right, knowing that I was many hours into an attempt and I was preparing for a big fight I hadn't done yet. But I at least roughly knew what to expect, which was enough for me to concoct a strategy. I started off by having my wizard cast haste on Lae'zel before the fight began and having Shadowheart stand close to the entrance of the portal with a Radiant Spirit Guardian's concentration and an elixir of Peerless Focus. Because enemies in this area relentlessly chase down the portal, and many of them are vulnerable to radiant damage, most enemies will filter themselves out without needing to attack them, or at least with very minimal attacking. Lae'zel I had off to the side to wipe out the ranged enemies who would not fall into this trap, while Astarion hid to the other side and sniped what enemies he could from the shadows. When the stronger enemies inevitably got too close, I used Thunderwave to launch most of them off into the water. If this did not work, my next plan was to use the wall of stone scroll I picked up to block the passage to the portal, as the rest of the enemies gathered around were strictly melee. In practice, this did not end up being necessary, and Halsin returned with a slim margin. We went back to camp and leveled up Halsin. I only really intended to use Halsin in the next section for a particular ability that I thought would be useful in the fight against Oliver, so I wasn't too concerned with any aspect of his progression except for ensuring he has access to an owlbear form. And so we chase down Oliver and have Halsin as our frontliner in owlbear form. The owlbear's Rupture ability can freely clear out waves of smaller enemies every turn, allowing me to slow the gradual descension of the wasting quiet aura and letting my wizard and Astarion take safe shots from far away. And with that, we have completed the necessary side quests to end the Shadow Curse. With our spaghetti of a story progression mostly ironed out, we continue on by entering the Gauntlet of Shar. And here it is time to show off another tactic. By approaching Balthazar's room with an invisible wizard and having them cast Knock on the door, we can open the door and run away with another invisibility spell to let Balthazar and his minions handle the coming fight. Unfortunately for us, Balthazar is actually overwhelmed so thoroughly that he dies while a substantial number of the Justiciars remain. But recall that before, I mentioned we would be seeing more out of Lae'zel's damage negation down the line, and now is a good time to capitalize on that. Using Shadowheart to cast Warding Bond on Lae'zel, Lae'zel receives resistance to all damage types. This means that for physical attacks specifically, all damage taken is halved and then reduced by another 5. While there are a very large number of enemies left behind, most of them deal primarily physical damage and in small bursts. As it happens, damage can reach 0 outright given the necessary conditions. And so sending in Lae'zel by herself to grab attention allows us to slowly wipe out the horde, with Lae'zel taking next to no damage and dealing substantial damage with her Great Weapon Master feat. We move on after an egregiously long time and use Knock again to open up the door to the vault. There's some gold and nice scrolls in here, but the particularly interesting find is the Callous Glow Ring. This ring adds a flat 2 radiant damage to any damage tick against an opponent who is illuminated, which further expands on our ability to deal damage with Magic Missile. We clear through the Gauntlet of Shar largely without incident, with the exception of the usual annoyance the self-same trial provides, and succeed the persuasion checks against Yurgir. From here, we hit level 7. We pick up the Greater Invisibility and Ice Storm spells. The former is just a nice utility all around, but the latter will be especially helpful for 2 later fights in particular. We also grab Commander's Strike and Fainting Attack for Lae'zel. This was where something very unfortunate for the proper documentation of this run occurred. I will let the footage ahead speak for me.
I'll smear your entrails on these walls.
As you have likely now realized, there was an extended period in which my recording software only captured audio from the game, with no video capture whatsoever. And it was a serious shame too, because I thought my strategies in the coming areas were actually quite inventive. But you will have to settle for my luscious voice to expand on what happened for the next section. Poor you. We passed the persuasion check to convince Shadowheart to free the Night Song, continued her romance side plot, and charged ahead to Moonrise Towers. I began the fight by baiting out Z'rell's counterspell with a failed Misty Step, which I then exploited to cast Ice Storm against her and the nearby zealots. Then I had Lae'zel charge in with haste and a freedom of movement granted by Shadowheart to allow her to walk on the ice safely, at which point she ran down the zealots before they could get off too many divine smites. After the zealots and Z'rell were dead, my wizard Misty stepped up to the rafter to knock down the archers with Thunderwave, and from there the allied units could clean up. Unfortunately, Jaheira died during this corrupted chunk of footage, which could have probably been avoided by taking out some of Moonrise Towers in advance to the siege, but there was nothing to be done about it by this point. We pick up again after I realized the error in my recording software with the first Ketheric boss fight. This fight isn't too troublesome. Taking advantage of Sanctuary to mess with the AI that focuses on specific allies helps to even out the damage output, and spells that require saving throws like Fireball allow us to damage Ketheric through his high AC. Dame Aelin turns out to actually be somewhat useful and a rare occurrence, and Ketheric retreats to the underground. We want to reach level 8 before reaching the fight with Merkel for a couple of reasons, and so our next stop will not be the giant cavity in the ground. Instead, we will run around the Shadowlands a bit longer to mop up easy experience. We pick up the Eversight ring for later, talk Garangoth and Thizabald into early graves, pat Scratch and the Owlbear Cub at the same time, pick up a couple of elixirs for the fights to come, and finally make our way down on the verge of reaching level 8. I actually intended to also grab the free bonuses to Intelligence, Wisdom and Charisma before going inside, but it slipped my mind in the midst of all the other preparation. We free Zevlor and Mazora, deceive Cressa to get some free experience, and kill a couple of scurrying intellect devourers to get us up to level 8. Here we pick up Dimension Door and Wall of Fire. The former was not actually as helpful as I imagined it would be, but it's a nice option to have for emergencies. The latter will have some specific utility in a couple of fights later down the line. We pick up the Warcaster feat to make it easier to maintain spell concentrations, which we have been increasingly reliant on as the story has progressed. For Shadowheart, we pick up Heavily Armoured. Normally this feat would be markedly less practical than simply reclassing Shadowheart to a War Cleric, but we can't do that of course, and Shadowheart having 14 strength and heavy armour proficiency will soon become very useful. For Lae'zel, we pick up Tough to further increase her survivability in the late game, and for Astarion we pick up Alert for the initiative bonus. His assassin subclass features allow him to get critical hits against opponents who haven't acted yet, and this feat ensures he will consistently be one of the first characters to act in a combat situation. Now we enter the fight against Merkel, and this was probably the one fight I was most anxious about planning for in the whole of the run. He is simply statistically overwhelming for a character at level 8, and dealing damage to him while managing his self-healing and countless necromites is no easy task. Reclassing would have allowed for some unique setups to manage these elements, but we can't use those. My conclusion was that the only way we were going to beat this fight was by running down Merkel with damage too quickly for him to heal, and so I planned out the whole fight from beginning to end to maximise damage output and minimise his chances to heal. In the days leading up to the Illithid colony, I made a point to buy as many useful spell scrolls as I could to make this possible, which you will see in practice now. I started by having Astarion go invisible to run over to Dame Aelin and free her, which instigated the fight. Astarion made use of his initiative to quickly land a critical hit on the Mind Flayer, while our wizard Misty stepped to the left platform and ran the necromites down with an Ice Storm scroll. Some of the necromites survived, so we used another scroll on the next turn. We made sure to clear out all of the enemies we could before confronting Ketheric directly, for which we made use out of a Conjure Elemental scroll. A Water Elemental has a free Misty Step equivalent per turn and substantial damage output beyond that, making them ideal for wiping out the stragglers faster than Ketheric could spawn them. Only once all of the enemies and enemy spawns were cleared out did we focus our efforts on Ketheric himself, who we were quickly able to overwhelm, with Lae'zel and Aelin grabbing attention while everyone else peppered him from afar. Just before the phase transition, I had Shadowheart cast Protection from Evil and Good on Lae'zel in preparation for the fight to come. And now it is time for Merkel himself. It took mere moments for the concentration on Protection from Evil and Good to be broken, but it was worth a shot. Now came my strategy. Casting Darkness on Merkel's position would blind him, not only reducing his accuracy with melee attacks, but also preventing him from siphoning his summons for healing. Furthermore, because the Darkness radius only extends so high up, Astarion can reliably shoot the top of Merkel's head through the darkness. My Wizard and Shadowheart can do the same using Fireball Scrolls and Guiding Bolt respectively to maximise damage output per turn. With the Eversight ring on Lae'zel can be unaffected by the darkness and continue attacking Merkel through it. My Water Elemental is less useful in this phase, but they are still capable of attacking Merkel for minor damage and then Misty stepping away for safety. Merkel broke concentration on darkness at one point, but taking a potion of speed allowed my wizard to reapply it. From here, it was simply a race of pure damage output to take Merkel out before his summons could overwhelm us. But the full weight of each of these individual elements just barely won out enough for us to kill Merkel in time, and that ends the last boss for the second act of the story. In a fashion only I could emulate, I evidently managed to forget to record the next section as well, most notably the fight against the Githyanki in the astral plane. There wasn't much to say, however, other than the fact that Thunderwave is as good for knocking enemies off of platforms as it always is. The main thing I should note is that we have equipped Ketheric's heavy armour on Shadowheart, hence why I previously picked up the heavily armoured feat for her. Ketheric's armour reduces all damage taken by 2, and an obscure mechanic you might not be aware of is that this damage negation also works to reduce damage taken from Warding Bond. This means, for example, that if Lae'zel takes 4 points of damage while bonded, that Shadowheart will only take 2 damage. With both Lae'zel and Shadowheart having the tough feat, we have effectively made Lae'zel into a wall that should be able to survive just about any attack provided we keep her healed. And what's especially great is that this isn't the last element we'll have to mention about Lae'zel's survivability. And so we pick up again at the entrance to Baldur's Gate, where we sneak past the checkpoint with an invisibility spell and use Enhanced Leap and Featherfall to get Lae'zel over to the waypoint in Worm's Rock. If you know exactly what path to take in advance, there is one very powerful tool you can get right at this point in the game, which we will do now. We progress down into the Trials of Baldurin through the Worm's Rock prison and complete them all without much trouble. For the Chamber of Courage, we cheese the fight by sending Shadowheart in alone with Sanctuary and waiting. Because the only objective is to survive the fight for 4 turns, none of the enemies can hurt Shadowheart for the duration of the trial with anything other than AoE attacks. We clear out the last of the trials and head to Ansur's arena, but we will not be fighting him just yet. Instead, we have Astarion sneak around the side and pick up the Helm of Baldurin from the pedestal before teleporting out. The Helm of Baldurin is arguably the best headpiece in the game. It heals the wearer for 2 hit points per turn, provides them with a +1 to armor class and saving throws, makes them immune to being stunned, and negates all critical hits. We, of course, give this immediately to Lae'zel, as while the health regeneration may be slow, it's more than enough to offset the limited damage she already takes. We can expand even further on this once we enter the lower city by picking up the Ring of Regeneration from Sorceress Sundries, which heals the wearer for another 1d4 hit points at the start of every turn. Now we have just one more element to add to Lae'zel to take her survivability to new heights, and for this we need a highly calculated and otherwise risky path. But before that, we happen to hit level 9 while exploring the city, at which point we pick up the Conjure Elemental and Wall of Stone spells. The former is arguably one of the best spells in the game, providing you with basically a free extra companion in every fight, and the latter will be especially helpful for one boss coming up a bit later. Now we enter the Devil's Sphere, and some of you likely see where this is going. By interacting with several items scattered around the place, we can ask Helsik for help with reaching the House of Hope. We get free passage by agreeing to pick up the Gauntlets of Hill Giant Strength for her, and so we sneak into the House of Hope. But we are not ready just yet to fight Raphael. That is not why we have come here. Entering the archives and succeeding the deception check, we find the Amulet of Greater Health on a small pedestal. By having our wizard keep the attention of the archivist, we can have Astarion place the ritual pouch that Helsik gave us onto the pedestal and take the amulet off without raising the alarm. Then we leave the House of Hope without Raphael ever knowing we were there. This amulet provides the wearer with an automatic 23 Constitution and advantage on all Constitution saving throw checks. As you'd likely imagine, we give this to Lae'zel, who gets a large boost in max health to expand her survivability to the upper limits. Now it is time to fight Viconia. Viconia has one of the best shields in the game, which I would like to get for Shadowheart sooner rather than later. This was when I finally decided what I wanted to do with Gale. Going back to camp and going through each of his levels, I subclassed him as an Evocation Wizard and made sure to specifically pick up Conjure Elemental, Wall of Fire, and Ice Storm. A small quirk that some people may not be aware of is that, provided you extinguish the fire surface first, you can place an ice surface underneath a wall of fire. This will cause the wall of fire to deal all of its normal damage while the ice surface slows the movement of anyone underneath and forces them to make saving throws against going prone. Bringing 2 wizards into the Viconia fight, we set up a wall of fire along the narrow entryway and use both of our water elementals to freeze the ground close to us, while making use of Ice Storm to freeze the ground further away. The vast majority of the enemies were incapable of passing through one end of the entryway to the other, and we could quickly wipe out the few that barely survived. The fight nearly spun out of control when Viconia got through and used her divine intervention, but by this point Viconia was low on health and we finished her off. We complete Shadowheart's questline by freeing her from Shar's influence, Lae'zel turns her back on Vlaakith for good, and we pick up the Shadeslayer coat for Astarion. This coat reduces the critical hit attack roll threshold while hiding by 1. If you've been keeping count, you'd know this now means Astarion can land a critical hit on a roll of 18 or above. Shortly after, Astarion breaks into the Sorcerer's Sundry's vault for the Tharkeite Codex and the Annals of Karsus. Giving the Tharkeite Codex to our wizard and then removing the curse from her gives her a permanent 20 temporary hit points after every long rest. Theoretically, I could have opted to give this buff to Lae'zel instead, but she has enough health by this point and keeping our wizard alive is more difficult. We head back to the House of Grief because we forgot to loot a few things while there, and the brief fight outside gets us to level 10. We pick up the Firebolt cantrip as well as the Blight and Hold monster spells. There is exactly one fight that I intend to use the Blight spell for, and Hold monster is very useful for several fights coming up. Astarion gets his next feat, and for this we pick up Lucky. Lucky allows you to re-roll attack rolls that fail a limited number of times per long rest, which is especially helpful when paired with Sharpshooter to maximize the chance of landing difficult hits. We pick up Precision Attack and Goading Attack for Lae'zel to improve her ability to keep attention in combat and to boost the chance that she will land important hits. We have Gale meet with Mystra, confront Gortash at his coronation, convince Will to break his pact with Mizora, and now we make our way to Cazador. This was one of the easiest bosses of the run. We largely reused the same strategy that we used against Viconia, with the addition of giving daylight to Lae'zel's weapons and ensuring Astarion stays far behind so that Cazador cannot capture him. All of Cazador's summons were filtered out and Cazador himself was taking a high amount of radiant damage every turn, so we cleared him out quickly. The only notable thing about this fight was that my game actually immediately crashed when I tried to interact with his coffin, and as you probably expect, my last save was from before the fight began, meaning I needed to do it again, but this thankfully happened on one of the easier fights of the run anyway. We enter the cutscene with Astarion after getting back, and this was actually my first time seeing this variation of the cutscene in particular. On my first playthrough, Astarion sought to free the spawn by his own volition, so I didn't know what dialogue options to pick when playing out this variation. But a quick Google search later and we get Astarion to free the spawn and kill Cazador, finishing his questline. We make sand castles with Shadowheart and confront Lorroakan the next morning. Equipping the Eversight ring on our wizard allows us to hide in a darkness spell that prevents any of Lorroakan's elementals from targeting us, giving us free reign to spam the enemies down on all sides with magic missile. I realised during this fight that I forgot to pick up the Artistry of War scroll from the vault, so I quickly ran back down afterwards to do so. The main reason for doing Lorroakan's fight was to access the equipment at the bottom of his tower. The Robe of the Weave is a considerable upgrade to the Protectee Sparks wall, and the Markohesh gear is effectively better in every way than the Spell Sparkler, giving us its own means of building up lightning charges among several other benefits. From here, we sell some of the expensive equipment we have laying around to get the dead shot for Astarion. This bow decreases the critical hit attack roll threshold by 1. If you've been paying attention, you'd know this means that Astarion now lands critical hits whenever he rolls a 17 or above. You can probably see where this is going. We bring Karlach back to Dammon to get the next part of her questline done, and now it is time to take on Ansur. Ansur uses an attack several times throughout the fight called Stormheart Nova. This deals an incredibly high amount of lightning damage to all targets in the arena and requires getting behind cover to avoid taking the hit. There are several attuned crystals scattered across the arena that you can use as cover for the first strike, but they will all break and cannot be used again the next time Ansur uses this move. This is why I picked up the Wall of Stone spell earlier on. Hiding behind a wall of stone allows you to block off damage from Stormheart Nova, effectively making for as many turns worth of cover as you have spell slots to cast it with. And with Markohesh gear, we get a free extra cast of it per long rest. Now if you're paying attention to this footage, you probably realise the mistake I made that took me far too long to notice. I entered this fight without equipping Wall of Stone on my wizard, which could end up being no trouble, because I have a Wall of Stone scroll on hand I picked up all the way back at the Githyanki Creche I could use instead. Except I don't, because apparently I sold it earlier when stocking up on all the gear I was getting from my party members. I would have gone through the hour's worth of footage to find the exact moment I got rid of it, but I couldn't be bothered. If it wasn't for the fact that you can retreat from a fight to reset it, this would have effectively been game over for the run. But luckily we could retreat, and I entered into the fight again later with the right spells equipped. Unfortunately, the attuned crystals had been destroyed by this point, but it was better than not having the spell on hand. My strategy made use out of a warding bond on Lae'zel and Kareska's favour on my wizard to make both characters resistant to lightning damage. The evasion perk Astarion got at level 7 also allows him to mitigate damage from attacks that require dexterity saving throws, effectively giving him resistance to Ansar's lightning attacks as well. This gave us free reign to attack him while taking minimal damage from his reaction, with only Shadowheart staying up the back to provide healing from afar. And this was when my lack of prior knowledge about honor mode reared its head one more time, almost to devastating effect. My prior understanding was that, when Ansar reached low health, he would start charging up a Storm Heart Nova on his next turn. I did not realise that he actually starts charging it up the instant he reaches low health, even if it is not his turn. So by attacking him with my wizard to get him past that threshold, and having no speed potions on hand, I nearly threw the entire run by giving none of my companions enough cover to block off the next Storm Heart Nova. Luckily, a Misty Step was enough for my wizard to duck behind a wall, and Lae'zel's pure survivability let her tank through the Storm Heart Nova, enabling her to run in afterwards and land the final hit. Completing this fight rewards us with Balduran's Giant Slayer, which will be our main weapon for Lae'zel for the rest of the run. It provides a damage boost based on your strength modifier, advantage on large enemies, and a giant form that further increases damage dealt for the next 10 turns. All three of these elements will become relevant for a later fight. With this, we can complete Will's questline without ever having used them over the course of the playthrough, and now we make our way over to the second fight with Auntie Ethel. Auntie Ethel isn't a necessary boss for any of the companion questlines, and she's pretty far out of the way for minimal reward, so there isn't much reason to track her down. However, recall what I said earlier in the video. But in my case, I'm not doing this for the stat booster. I'm doing this because I hate Auntie Ethel on a personal level and want her to die painfully. So of course we weren't going to skip her. We give everyone freedom of movement before entering the fight to prevent any companions from being hit with Hold Person. Using Arrows of Ilmater, we can prevent the Pearl Spore Bells from regenerating health, and because they are plants, our Blight spell deals heavy damage to them. This allows us to quickly clear them, at which point we can deal with Ethel's invisible clones using the free C invisibility that we get for being a divination wizard. This is where I noticed something funny, however. Recall that earlier I mentioned to you that you can tell the real Ethel apart from the fake Ethels by seeing which one has the Fey Life condition. Only the real Ethel will have this condition. But as I checked through the clones in this fight, I realised that none of them had the Fey Life condition. That was when it finally occurred to me. I killed Ethel previously in the first act and looted the amulet that gives the Fey Life condition from her corpse, giving it to Shadowheart. It was only now that I realised this was why I couldn't see the condition on any of the Ethel's stat tables, and this was a bit of a headache as I now did not know how to tell the Ethels apart from each other. But for a boss with such a small health pool, it was simply a matter of brute forcing our way through the clones until we ran her down. It's about time we continued the main story, and so I head down to the Iron Throne. I make an effort to save as many of the prisoners as possible, but a couple of them died. There's a glitch you can use here to have Lae'zel jump out of the submarine before the countdown timer starts to clear out the Sahuagin without a time limit. However, a glitch is a glitch and I didn't want to use it for this run. Shortly after, we hit level 11 where we pick up Globe of Invulnerability and Cone of Cold. Importantly, this is the level where Shadowheart gains access to Hero's Feast, which is probably the single most useful spell in the game for this run. This spell gives all nearby allies a large boost to their maximum health and, more importantly, spawns a chest full of camp supplies. This spell effectively allows us to take 3 long rests whenever we want for the rest of the playthrough with very minimal cost, which also means being able to easily reset trader inventories without reclassing through withers. We will take full advantage of this for the rest of the run. We move on to the Steelwatch Foundry, where unfortunately Tubing gets back into a corner and quickly dies. On my first playthrough I had him survive until the end, so I had to look up what you need to do in order to progress the quest, but after finding the book on the shelf we went for the Steelwatcher Titan. This fight was no serious trouble. Our first priority was rushing down the Steel Watchers who protected the Titan. They don't take long to kill and they automatically self-destruct past a certain health threshold, so this only took a couple of turns. A problem that came up was that none of our companions, not even Astarion with a critical hit, dealt enough damage to get through the defensive bulwark. This meant it was effectively a free healing phase for him whenever he went into it, but this was luckily on occasion spread out far enough that we could simply outdamage his healing and move on. We move on to fight Gortash, and for this we finally level up Karlach. We pick up the aspect of the Wolverine, which has a unique interaction with spiked bulbs. Throwing a spiked bulb at a target with that aspect also maims them for one turn, allowing you to stun opponents for extended periods of time if you make use of multiple. I was going to use this in the upcoming fight, but I forgot about it and it didn't end up being necessary anyway. Beyond this, we basically just give everything we can to Karlach that allows her to tank damage, including temporarily the equipment from Lae'zel. Using the same enhanced leap and featherfall tactic we originally used to enter Worm's Rock, we can sneak around the side and crawl up the vines to reach Gortash's boss arena without any other fights. Our first priority in this battle is to kill the Black Gauntlets, who have the ability to cast Dominate Person, which would quickly run the fight out of control if they were given too many opportunities to make use out of it. For this purpose, we filter all of the enemies through the entrance to the building, which ensures we do not get caught in the way of any of the traps laying about. When Gortash transitions to his next phase, we make use out of Remove Curse from Shadowheart to negate his legendary action, and from there it's just a race to damage him fast enough before we run out of spell slots. We finish Karlach's questline and promptly replace her again with Lae'zel. Next up is Orin, but before we can do her fight, we need to confront Sarevok. This fight was kind of humorous, so I'll let it play out in its entirety before going into the explanation.
Yes, here. Into the shadows.
I will not tolerate impudence. This place shall be your grave.
By going through the first phase of the Murder Tribunal, you can ensure Sarevok is alone in the room with you when you start the fight against him. Getting a free critical hit from Astarion allowed me to paralyze him, at which point my damage output could simply run him into the ground before he could act. And so we saved Valeria and used invisibility to sneak our way past all the enemies leading up to the Temple of Baal. From here, all we had left to do before the endgame is to confront Orin. Orin herself was quite easy, because as you've likely noticed, our wizard's build happens to be perfectly fitted to outpace her gimmick. Using high-level magic missiles with the Psychic Spark Amulet and extra damage ticks from the Callous Glow Ring allows us to nearly instantly level her unstoppable charges, at which point it is simply a matter of dealing with her fairly manageable health pool for this section of the game. I considered using the Gloves of Belligerent Skies to ensure even more that her unstoppable charges would be erased, but I didn't do this in the end, and in hindsight it wouldn't have been a good idea. The lower initiative and armour class would have been bad for dealing with the rest of the battle. The harder part was dealing with her minions, as their special invisibility doesn't seem to be countered by sea invisibility, so it was a matter of setting up ice surfaces all around to force the enemies into going prone and revealing themselves. But with that, the final Netherstone was collected, and that got us up to the max level. For this level, we picked up Blink and Expeditious Retreat. It might be obvious that I was running out of ideas by this point, as I didn't end up using either of these spells for the rest of the playthrough. For our final feat, we boosted our intelligence to 20. This is generally good, but there was one specific reason I wanted high intelligence for the next section. For Astarion, we picked up the Mobile feat, as well as Shieldmaster for Shadowheart and Lucky for Lae'zel. Now all we had left in the main story was the Netherbrain.
No one back home will ever believe this.
But of course, we had unfinished business. We went back to the House of Hope, demolished Harlep with a Hold Monster spell, went down to save Hope, and this was where I made one of the most devastating mistakes of the run. As you might have noticed, I skipped the fight against the Spectator in the Underdark. I did not realise that Spectators had a legendary action, let alone that this legendary action triggers specifically when a Spectator takes many ticks of damage in a row, like my wizard build is optimised for. The resulting use of Ocular Nightmare caused a lot of trouble, but because Lae'zel had freedom of movement, she managed to get through it pretty much unscathed and was about to take revenge. What instead happened was that the game decided to cheat me by cancelling her jump in mid-air with the Spectator's reaction, forcing her to stop her jump and drop down to her death. At this point I thought I might have screwed up the entire run, but luckily our Water Myrmidon was able to pull through while our companions guzzled an inordinate number of supreme healing potions, and in the end we barely scraped by, but it was pretty terribly misplayed on my part. So we saved hope, recovered from our wounds with the restoration facet, and now it was finally time for the crowning piece of this run, Raphael. One thing that I haven't mentioned yet is that, over the course of this playthrough, I have been gradually building up a supply of smoke powder bombs in Shadowheart's inventory. By this point in the playthrough I had exactly 20. Your instinct might be to say that my solution was to bomb the entirety of the arena, but this actually wasn't my plan. You see, the soul pillars that Raphael uses to gain power are vulnerable to force damage, which happens to be the damage type that smoke powder bombs deal. By setting up 5 against each pillar, we could have Shadowheart rapidly run around the arena and blow up each soul pillar within the first few turns, quickly ironing out the most debilitating part of this fight. And so we enter the conversation, successfully convince Yrgir to join us with a nat 20, and begin the fight. Here comes the reason I wanted 20 intelligence. With 20 intelligence, an elixir of Battle Mage's power, and numerous equipment pieces that all boost spell save DC, we can have a very high chance of landing Hold Monster on Raphael. This will completely immobilize him for the rest of his turn and allow us to land 3 critical hits. From here, it was just a matter of constant healing with the help of Hope and Shadowheart to outpace the damage his Cambions were dealing. Amazingly, we got through to the end of the fight without needing to use Hope's Divine Intervention, which would have allowed us to take a free long rest in the middle of battle if our resources were dwindled too much. In the end, this fight wasn't as difficult as I imagined it would be, and we recruited Yrgir as a helper for the final battle. This fight got us the Helldusk armour set, arguably the best armour in the game, which we of course gave immediately to Lae'zel. Now it was actually time for the endgame. We retrieve the Silver Sword of the Astral Plane from Voss and get our last elixirs for the run. To reset trader inventories, I did numerous back-to-back long rests with the help of Hero's Feast so that every companion could have an adequate elixir for the final boss. And so we head our way down to the Morphic Pool and sneak past some intellect devourers to reach the Netherbrain. I made use of Fox's Cunning and 4 inspiration points to attempt to get a nat 20 on the final skill check. Doing so would reduce the max health of the final boss. Unfortunately, it did not work out, so we moved on as normal. We choose to side with Orpheus against the Emperor, free Orpheus from his chains, and let him turn into an Illithid for the final confrontation. We get a rallying cry from the friends we've made over the course of the playthrough, use invisibility on each companion one by one to sneak them up to the brainstem, and use the 4 potions of angelic slumber we've stockpiled over the course of the playthrough to give everyone a long rest before the final battle. We begin the fight by running down the Emperor and the Dream Guardians with Orpheus's Illithid powers and a string of allies called onto the field. We kill the dragon, making sure to spread our companions apart to ensure their fire breath cannot target all of us at once, and then sneak around the sides of the arena to take out the Mind Flayers guarding the Crown of Karsus. At the Crown of Karsus, I attempted to use Globe of Invulnerability to ensure that Orpheus would not be interrupted while channeling it. This was another lapse on my part, as I forgot I had been concentrating on haste for my wizard, and that using the globe would instantly make her lethargic, stopping her from using the spell. But it wasn't necessary in the end anyway. And now it is time for the Netherbrain. This fight gives you 5 turns to kill an enemy with 450 health, who becomes invulnerable on the next turn to any damage type you deal on the present turn. Our only option is damage to the high heavens. If I had planned out this run this far in advance, I would have probably opted to save Muthara. Being a paladin, her divine smites could theoretically do a lot more for us than most of our companions, but that ship has long sailed. Instead, I made use of every buff I could level on Lae'zel all at once. With an elixir of Cloud Giant Strength, Orin's Giant Slayer, Giant Form, Githyanki Flight, and Celestial Haste, Lae'zel could theoretically run down the Netherbrain's health bar almost within a single turn. Unfortunately, this did not work how I wanted it to. The Netherbrain's reaction broke Lae'zel's concentration on Celestial Haste. Luckily, this variation of haste does not cause lethargy, but it still meant she'd not deal as much damage as she needed to. So was it over? Were we doomed to run out of time? Of course not, because despite my constant lapses, I did actually have the foresight to imagine something like this might happen. This is why, just before entering the Morphic Pool, I brought our companions to Velogir's fireworks. The basement contains a giant deposit of fireworks that can explode when triggered, and so I brought all of them into the fight with me, laying them down beside Lae'zel's feet. Lae'zel proceeded to fall prone in a shockingly unfortunate turn of events, but the fireworks she had already left behind were enough to bring the Netherbrain down to low health, at which point, all that was needed was a single arrow from Astarion. In classic fashion, Astarion rolled a nat 1, but this is precisely why we have the lucky feat, which allowed Astarion to reroll his attack and land the final hit to defeat the Netherbrain once and for all. With the Netherbrain defeated and all companion questlines done, the heroes that saved Baldur's Gate go their separate ways. We convince Orpheus to stay alive to witness the coming glory of his people, Lae'zel leaves to take the fight to Vlaakith, Gale recovers the crown of Karsus for Mystra, Astarion retreats back to the shadows, Karlach and Will leave for Avernus, and our wizard and Shadowheart settle down. And with a party months down the line to reminisce on old times, we prove that yes, you can beat Baldur's Gate 3's Honor Mode with no reclassing or multiclassing. This run was a lot of fun, not least because there was a certain appeal in playing through Honor Mode with every character roughly being the same in gameplay as they are in the story. I can recommend doing this challenge for yourself if you want to approach Honor Mode with a more committed playstyle than the game necessitates for you. However, I will be glad to do a slightly less stressful run next time. My name is Asta, and thank you for watching.